In episode 1 of The Gentleman, you get introduced to Eddie, who is working for the United Nations, doing good work, but then he gets word that his dad is on death's door. His dad, however, isn't just anybody. His dad is the Duke of Halstead. So his dad passing away could have a big impact on Eddie, although technically it really shouldn't. Eddie isn't the oldest son. No, that title goes to his brother Freddie, who is a massive, massive screw-up, but that screw-up is likely to inherit the title Duke and take over the family's massive estate. The family's butler, Ahmed, reaches out to Eddie and lets him know about the state that his father's in so that he can rush back and see him before he passes away. When he arrives at his family home, which is a giant mansion, he's greeted by Freddie, his sister Charlie, and his mother. Eddie is able to talk to his dad right before his dad passes away, and the advice he gives him is take care of your brother. He's not going to survive. And the concerns over Freddie carry over at the funeral. Charlie pulls Eddie aside and says this estate has been in the family's name for 600 years, and Freddie will put it up his nose by Christmas. You got to do something. But Edward is completely content with just letting that happen. He doesn't feel like it's his place. At least, not yet. That all changes, though, when they read the Duke's will. Ahmed starts reading it off, and Freddie's expecting to hear his name, but he doesn't. He hears Edward's name, which comes as a shock to everybody, including Edward. They had no idea that their father was not planning on leaving the estate in Freddie's hands. Although it does make a lot of sense. Freddie's a drug addict. He's got a penchant for gambling. He's not exactly responsible. And he also does not handle this news well at all. He flips out, he causes a scene, and he embarrasses himself in a lot of ways. The thing is, the family, though, is used to this behavior. Eventually, when Freddie calms down, Edward has to go have a word with him to talk about the awkwardness. He had no idea that his dad was planning on doing this, after all. But Freddie admits that one of the reasons why he flipped out is because he has huge, huge debts. He was planning on taking that inheritance and paying off those debts, and now he doesn't have it. And these debts aren't exactly to Sally Mae or Capital One. They're to big-time loan sharks, people that you don't want to trifle with. He got involved in some real estate, and he took some money to pay for that investment from a guy he met in rehab. But that guy, whose name is Tommy Dixon, is a part of a major crime family. The amount of money was originally $4 million, but because of the debt and the interest and all that, they want $8 million, and they want it by the end of the week or else. And Freddie's freaking out because he knows that or else could be his life. But Eddie tells him, Freddie, I can't get you $8 million by the end of the week. But because he feels bad for his brother about getting passed up for this Duke title, he's going to at least try. Eddie does have some options. There's about $2 million on hand. And when he meets with Ahmed, Ahmed has to break the news that while he's rich on paper, he's not exactly rich in cash. But there are assets he can sell. There's a really expensive painting that his father owned. There's also the house. Now, it's been in the family for 600 years, but there is a buyer that is interested. The potential buyer wants to remain anonymous right now, but he is willing to pay above market value. Eddie tells Ahmed that he will entertain offers, but he's not dead set on selling. After all, the house has been in the family for literally centuries. After meeting with Ahmed, Eddie goes and walks around the grounds, trying to figure out how to get out of this predicament that his brothers dragged him into. That's when he gets a visit from a woman named Susie Glass. She introduces herself and says that she was in business with his late father, which comes as a surprise to Eddie because his father wasn't known for his business acumen. But this particular business was, for Eddie's father, sit back and collect money. Because what Susie Glass's business was running a marijuana farm on the grounds. It was very, very well hidden. Even the kids didn't know. And it brought in a ton of money. The reason why Susie's shown up is because she wants to keep this operation going. She tells Edward that it's a really easy gig for him. He sits back and about once a year he receives a large sum of money for being the landlord. But he informs Susie that unfortunately he might have to put the house on the market. That doesn't really work for Miss Glass or her operation, but Edward doesn't really care about that at the moment. If anything, he wants to renegotiate the deal that his dad made. But Susie Glass tells him to just think about this situation and get back to her. Obviously, if the current predicament he's in would force him to sell the house, that doesn't really work for them, so they might be open to something. He wraps up the conversation with Miss Glass and he starts to head back home. The property is 15,000 acres, so he's got time. And that's when he runs into Jeff. Jeff is the groundskeeper for the estate. He's worked for the family for years, and he's somebody that Edward wants to pick the brain of regarding this whole Susie Glass fiasco. At first, he asks what's his involvement, and Jeff says, I kind of just stick to myself. But then he brings up the predicament that he's in, lightly. He doesn't bring up the whole fact that Freddie owes $8 million. He just says he's in a predicament and he might need these people's help. And Jeff explains that these people are dangerous, but they will help. It will come at a cost, though. The good news for him is they're businessmen, and if there's something that Edward can help them with, they're at least willing to sit down and have a conversation. So the next day, Eddie calls up Susie and explains that he needs $8 million. His brother's in debt to a Liverpoolian drug cartel, and that's one of the big reasons why he needs to negotiate. If she can help him out, then he might be willing to not sell the property. He goes on to tell her that half of that is interest, and she says, if you can get 4, I can probably take care of the other 4. Susie tells her brother Jack about this situation, and he says, yeah, I know Tommy Dixon and his brother, the Gospel. They claim to have God on their side. They're tough, but I think you'll be able to actually win them over when they find out who our dad is. With that information, Susie goes and has a chat with Tommy Dixon. She explains her business interest in this matter of paying off Freddie's debt. She explains who her dad is, and that gets her the meeting. They go back and forth on negotiations, but eventually Tommy agrees to wipe out the $4 million interest in return for the original $4 million loan and $1 million in their weed. There's one thing Tommy wants in return, though, that isn't going to cost a dime. He wants Freddie to apologize and admit that he's a cock. While Susie was negotiating this, Edward had his own meeting. He wasn't planning on it, but the potential buyer for the property sent a representative and offered $250,000 just to sit down and hear his offer. And at that amount of money, Edward says, yeah, okay, I'll go hear this guy out. And the guy's name's Stanley Johnston, with a T. Johnston is very well put together. He's one of these guys that definitely enjoys the finer things in life. And when he presents the offer to Edward, it is a ton of money. But Edward says, I'm sorry, I'm decided not to sell. While they don't agree on a sale of the house, they do agree on a sale of the wine because Edward's family has a very expensive wine collection, and Johnston loves wine, so he gets about $3 million for it. When Edward gets back to the estate, he meets up with Susie, and she gives him the good news about getting the debt whittled down from 8 to 4. And he's like, all right, great, we're in the clear. We'll hand off this money tomorrow, and we'll be done with this situation. But when he goes to check his safe, the $2 million that was in the safe is gone. And that's because Freddie's vices have reared its ugly head once again. He's got a quote-unquote sure thing going down in a boxing match. Edward needs that money back. But Freddie isn't listening to reason, so Edward and Susie head off to the boxing match. Boxing is something that Susie is well aware of. Her brother owns a gym, so he's actually at the boxing match. And he gives them some unfortunate news. The guy that Freddie placed the bet with, he never pays up. You either lose the bet, or if you win, he uses his goons to just scare you off. At this news, Edward becomes furious. He walks up to the table with Freddie and the guy that Freddie placed the bet with, and he demands the money back. But the guy says, no, too late. It doesn't matter anyway. The fighter that Freddie bet on ends up losing. But Susie says, let me talk to the guy that Freddie placed the bet with. Maybe I can convince him to give that money back. The next day, Edward and Susie stake out this guy's house. And while they're waiting for this guy to come out, Edward asks Susie if she's ever heard of a Stanley Johnston. She's never heard of him, and the reason why Edward is asking is because it seemed like Edward had hinted on the fact that he knew about their operation. They then get out of the car and they walk up to the house where the guy who Freddie placed the bet with has decided to give the money back, although he had some convincing from Susie's men. He's been beaten to a bloody pulp. This is pretty eye-opening for Edward. He's actually seeing what these people are capable of right in front of him. Edward then heads home and he sees Freddie just enjoying his life, doing some skeet shooting, when he informs Freddie that he was able to get the money back. He tells him that the reason why is because he never places the bet, so stay away from betting with that guy. He then gets to the matter of dealing with Tommy Dixon. He says that he's going to handle the debt, but the one thing that Tommy Dixon wants in return is for Freddie to admit that he's a cock, but he needs to do so wearing an outfit and being recorded doing it. Freddie was fine with all of this up until Edward said that he wanted to film it. And then all of a sudden, Freddie's mood changes. Freddie doesn't realize that this is a $4 million video we're talking about. He would be one of the highest paid actors in the world. Edward has to give him a little tough love and remind him that he's doing this because he got everybody into this mess. And if this is what Tommy Dixon wants for $4 million off, then he's going to get it. Later that day, Tommy Dixon shows up with an associate, a kid really, named Jethro, who's going to count the money while Tommy enjoys the little show that Freddie's going to put on for him. Edward and Susie are both in attendance to make sure that this goes down correctly. Despite his pleading and begging, Tommy makes Freddie get in the chicken suit and he starts making him do the video. But the more that Tommy likes it and enjoys it, the more it pisses off Freddie. It's embarrassing for him. Tommy is really hammering home the point that Freddie needs to act like an actual chicken. He's slowly trying to break Freddie until finally Freddie says, "I need to go to the bathroom." But when Freddie comes back, he's holding a shotgun, and he shoots Tommy Dixon and kills him, opening up a new can of worms for the family. In episode 2, Eddie and Susie are in complete shock about what they just witnessed as Freddie just heads out to the lawn and acts like business as usual. And that's when young Jethro turns around because he was counting the money the entire time with headphones on, and he sees what happened. He had no idea. And he knows that because he was there, he's probably the next target, so he takes off running. Freddie, Eddie, Jeff, they all start combing the property to find this kid before he can, tip somebody off. And Jethro tries. He tries to send a text to Tommy's brother, the gospel, as they call him, but it's a bunch of gobbledygook. Before he can actually get a message to the gospel, he's caught. And Freddie wants to kill him right away, but Eddie doesn't want to do anything of the sort. He just wants to sort this whole thing out. He doesn't want to kill anybody. He never wanted to kill anybody in the first place. They don't quite know what to do with Jethro, so they take him to the marijuana farm that's underneath the property, and they have Jimmy, the manager of the weed farm, look after him. After dropping Jethro off, Susie fills Eddie in on exactly what they're dealing with the gospel. He's one of the biggest cocaine dealers in the area. He's an angry guy, and he knows some powerful people, and he's going to eventually wonder where his brother is. Because of all that, they have to do a little bit of damage control. Susie decides to make a phone call to Felix. He's her cleaner, if you will. He cleans up and disposes dead bodies, like the one of Tommy Dixon. And as Susie was calling Felix, young Jethro was making his pitch to Edward that he wants to be let go. And Edward believes Jethro. He doesn't want to kill him anyway, but he also knows that he's going to have to convince Susie of this as well. He then heads up to the house to meet with Felix and Susie, and they can formulate a story on exactly what happened with Tommy Dixon. The story that Edward wants to pitch is the fact that things weren't good between Jethro and Tommy, and Jethro killed Tommy, disposed of the body, and is now on a container ship, which is what he actually wants to do. He wants to put him on a container ship to Australia and just let him live his life with part of the money. This will allow Edward and everybody else to play dumb. They filmed the video, they saw Tommy leave, and they haven't heard from him since. Now all that's left to do is film the chicken dancing scene, which they still haven't done yet. And even though Freddie doesn't want to, Eddie slaps the crap out of him and says, "You're going to do this because you killed a guy, you got us into this mess, and there's a slim chance you can get us out of it." This little dance gets interrupted when their mother walks in with an invitation from Stanley Johnston, who's hosting a party and wants Eddie to come. This comes as quite a surprise to Eddie. He thought his business with Stanley was done. And when Susie gets word of this invite, well, now she wants to meet Stanley Johnston as well. So even though Eddie thought that his business with Stanley was done, he's going to end up RSVPing to that party. As the group is filling Eddie and Freddie's mother in on exactly who Susie is, albeit all of it's a lie, they get a phone call from the gospel. It goes to Freddie's phone, but Freddie's too nervous, so Eddie answers and says, "Can I take a message?" And the gospel says, "Yeah, I'm looking for my brother, and apparently the last time that he was seen was with you." Eddie, of course, plays dumb. He says, "Yeah, swing by, we'll talk about it." And then they just wait for the gospel to show up, which he does a little while later. The gospel shows both Freddie and Eddie the text message that they got from Jethro, which is nonsense. They don't know what to make of it. And Eddie tells them the story that he made up about Jethro and Tommy getting into a fight, and that's all they know. It's pretty clear that the gospel doesn't quite buy this story, especially because he knows Jethro. He knows that Jethro isn't the murdering type, but he doesn't really have any other choice but to leave and accept it, but do so cautiously. With phase 1 of their plan underway, Eddie has to do phase 2. That's putting Jethro on a cargo ship. But in order to do that, he needs his passport. So he goes to Jethro, he asks where it is, and Jethro gives him the keys to his apartment and tells him where he can find that passport. Right before Eddie leaves to do this, he runs into his mother, who reveals to him that she knew about the operation all along. And what she's worried about is that Edward will fall into the same trap that his father fell into, just being consumed with money. But Eddie says, "Don't worry, Mom. It's not going to happen. As soon as I'm done with whatever mess I've gotten myself into, I'm going to remove their interest from the estate." That night, he heads to Jethro's apartment to find his passport, but he doesn't find the passport, at least not right away. What he does find, though, is one of the gospel and Tommy Dixon's men who have camped out in the apartment waiting for Jethro to return. Eddie is able to eventually find the passport, but he is caught by this guy, and a fight breaks out. Eddie ends up shooting the guy in the head, making it look like he committed suicide, but in doing so, he ends up taking a bullet to the abdomen, and he's pretty badly hurt. To make matters worse for Eddie, that night was Stanley Johnston's party. So he doesn't have time to go to the hospital and get himself stitched up. He has to put on a tux and make it look like he's not been shot. He meets up with Susie at the party. He doesn't tell her that he got shot. He does ask her, though, why exactly are we here again? And Susie wants to know exactly why Stanley Johnston is so interested in the property. What she has been able to figure out is how Stanley Johnston made his money. Crystal meth. At this party, while Eddie is introducing Stanley to Susie, Eddie rekindles with an old childhood friend, Princess Roseanne, who he just calls Rosie. They've known each other since they were kids. This gives Eddie an opportunity to get out of the conversation with Stanley and Susie, and him and Rosie walk off together. While Rosie and Eddie are making small talk, Rosie notices that Eddie is injured because he's bleeding profusely on his white shirt. She decides to go up and stitch him up herself, and as she's doing so, Susie and Stanley have gone outside to talk about business. Stanley's pretty blunt. He tells her that she's going to need a partner if she wants things to stay the way they are. She doesn't take too kindly to this. She just says, "Yeah, I'll think about it, and don't call me, I'll call you." She heads back inside to try to find Edward, and she does so with the princess stitching him up. And when the princess leaves, he fills Susie in on exactly why he got shot, but the good news is he got the passport at the end. He is starting to get good at this, though. Before he did leave the scene of the crime, he called Felix to clean it up. It's not a normal cleanup, though. They're going to make it look like Jethro killed this guy and then got away. And it's pretty smart because he had Felix bring the shotgun that killed Tommy. So when the gospel finds Tommy's body with the shotgun wound, and then they find this guy's body with that shotgun right next to it, it's not going to look suspicious at all. They're just going to put two and two together and say, oh, it must have been Jethro. The next day, Eddie gets more visitors, and this time it is the gospel. The gospel was able to find Tommy's body just like Eddie set up. Seems like the gospel is actually buying Eddie's story, but he didn't come here to admit defeat. He came here because the shotgun is an interesting one. It's clearly a rich one. And the gospel finds it fishy because the only place he figures that Jethro could have gotten it is the house. And Eddie, being quick on his feet, says, oh yeah, that's been missing. I noticed it after you left, but yeah, no, that is our shotgun. Once again, the gospel seems to actually buy this, but he wants to keep the gun until he's extracted judgment, upon which he will return the gun. And at this point, Eddie and Freddie just want the gospel to leave, so they're like, yeah, dude, just take it. See ya. With the gospel pulling away, Eddie feels like it's about time he fills in Freddie on the weed industry. Freddie, of course, is stunned. I mean, this is heaven for him, but while he's taking it all in, Eddie decides to free Jethro, and they head over to the docks to put him on one of those cargo ships and head off to Australia. Jethro, though, doesn't make it too far. Even though Eddie's intentions were good, Susie wasn't about to let Jethro just walk away with a bunch of money for basically doing nothing. She couldn't risk it. So she put Felix on that ship, and Jethro's not making it to Australia. Of course, Eddie doesn't know this. He thinks he's doing the right thing. And after he does put Jethro on that ship, unknowingly sending him off to his death, he tells Susie, "I think it's about time I meet your father." And they head to the prison. And Bobby Glass isn't treated like a normal prisoner. No, in fact, he has his own chef. It's a little eye-opening for Eddie, but he gets right to the point. He tells Bobby, "I want to renegotiate our deal," which comes as a surprise to Susie. She thought this was nothing more than just a friendly meeting. Eddie, though, just ignores her. He gets to the offer. He wants Bobby and the operation off his land by the end of the year, but in return, he guarantees that he will make Bobby much more money. Bobby's going to think about it, but as Susie and Eddie leave, Susie is pissed off that this offer wasn't run by her first. But in his opinion, too bad. In episode 3, Eddie gets called into a meeting with Susie Glass. She's a little concerned because Jimmy, the guy who's in charge of the weed farm, has gone missing. And he did so at a real inopportune time. He did so when he was supposed to deliver a massive weed shipment to a buyer that didn't receive that shipment and is demanding to know where his weed is. Now, at this point, Susie knows that Eddie or any of his staff had nothing to do with Jimmy's disappearance. The reason why she called him is because she needs his help. The guy who was going to buy the weed is named Tony Blair. He's kind of a scumbag, not the former prime minister. And Susie has promised Tony that they will steal a car for him. Because as Tony puts it, he's gotten into the buying, importing, exporting of fancy vehicles. There's a really, really, really nice green car that he needs to get his hands on. The problem is he recently got arrested. He's under house arrest. He's not supposed to be out after a certain time, so he needs somebody to steal that car for him, and they have a limited window to do so. Now, Susie is just focused on finding out where Jimmy is and, more importantly, where her weed is, while her father decided that it would be Eddie who steals the car, for reasons which she doesn't quite understand. This isn't really Eddie's bag. He doesn't really want to do it, but he's willing to at least entertain the idea, and he tells Susie, "I'm going to need something in return. You talked about increased profitability. Let's start off with a floor." She promises to get him a number and also promises to get him a date on when they will leave his property. Susie and Jack then escort Eddie out, and as Eddie gets to his car, Jack turns to Susie and says, "I don't really know what Dad sees in him." And Susie breaks it down. He's a former soldier who is calm under pressure. He killed somebody, but you'd never know it. He also has the rare ability to dabble in both worlds. He's a rich aristocrat, but he also doesn't mind getting his hands dirty, so he's a very valuable asset. A few hours later, they meet up with Tony Blair, and he breaks down how difficult stealing this car is going to be. Currently, the car is being held by a woman named Mercy, who's made a name for herself selling super high-end vehicles. What they're going to have to do is get into her office, find the Lamborghini's keys, replicate them, and then return those keys. That way, at night, they can sneak back in, they'll have a key, and they'll be able to just take it out. In order to do this, they're going to need stage 1, a distraction. And for that, Eddie calls on Freddie and his wife, Tammy. They're going to play rich billionaires who are coming in looking to buy a vehicle, while Eddie is going to pretend to be their manager, if you will, the guy that sets everything up. One of the issues early on, though, is that Freddie has developed this ridiculous East European/Russian accent. I mean, he's really diving into this role. And while Eddie is stressed out, thinking that because of this ridiculous accent, it's going to blow their cover, it actually ends up working. While Tammy drives this vehicle around erratically, which distracts Mercy and her crew, Eddie is able to sneak in her office and clone the key with, no time to spare. But he also finds something interesting in that office, a severed human finger. So it puts him on high alert that maybe Mercy isn't someone you should probably mess with. Now that Eddie has the key, he, Freddie, Tammy, they get the hell out of there. And while they were getting that key, Jimmy was located in the woods on the property, naked. He was located by Jeff, who stumbled upon him. Jimmy was driving to the drop-off, but as he was doing so, he got the munchies, so he stopped off at a local diner. As he was eating, this really attractive girl named Gabrielle started chatting him up, and it turned out they had a ton in common. What Jimmy didn't notice, because he was smitten so hard, was that Gabrielle was taking the keys to the vehicle and handing it off to a girl that looks a lot like her, so this other girl might be Gabrielle's sister. Jimmy, though, really felt like the two had a connection, so he put his number in Gabrielle's phone and he thought, there's no way she doesn't call me. I mean, this is like the cosmics coming together. This is true love. But once Gabrielle left, Jimmy noticed that the vehicle was gone. You might think, well, at this point, Jimmy's just got bamboozled, but no, Jimmy thought it was a pure coincidence. Right after all this happened, Jimmy's phone died, so it forced him to hitchhike. He ended up getting involved with a couple tweakers. They did drugs. He doesn't really remember much, but he was definitely tripping. And then he woke up in the woods. When Susie and Eddie hear this story, they know that this Gabrielle girl just played Jimmy, but Jimmy is convinced that Gabrielle will call, and when she does, he's just going to simply ask her about the keys. He has no idea what actually happened. After this debriefing with Jimmy, Eddie and Susie go into a private room to chat because Eddie wants to bring up the fact that he ran into a severed human finger, and, well, that wasn't a part of the plan. It escalates the situation because of who they're dealing with now. Because of that, he's wondering if there's a scenario where he doesn't have to steal the car. After all, she does have this lead of Gabrielle. But Susie says, no, you're still going to have to steal the car, mainly because my dad asked you to steal the car. That night, Eddie and Freddie head to Mercy's shop. Eddie is very clear to Freddie, when I get out of this car, you are to go home. Freddie, though, wants to discuss why exactly Eddie is so hard-headed about this situation. Why isn't he doing what his dad did, just collect an easy $5 million every year? And Eddie tells him this is about control. It's about removing ourselves from a criminal organization, which Freddie finds ironic because in order to remove themselves from a criminal organization, they're literally becoming criminals. Edward, however, doesn't see it like that. He doesn't think they're criminals, as he proceeds to put on a ski mask to go steal a car. As Eddie makes his way into the shop, he starts to hear screaming, and curiosity gets the best of him. He finds out where that severed human finger came from. It came from some random guy who is chained up. And Eddie can't let this guy just sit there to probably die. So he puts him in the Lambo, and he gets ready to leave when he gets a phone call from Freddie. Now, even though he told Freddie, you need to go home, Freddie didn't go home. Freddie decided to play watchdog. This actually ends up paying off because Mercy and her two goons end up returning to the shop. So Freddie wanted to tip off his brother that there are issues. You need to get out of there. And Eddie's able to get out of there. But Freddie, however, is unable to start his vehicle and he gets caught. This all happens pretty fast and Eddie doesn't know that his brother has been taken. In fact, he actually thinks his brother was able to get away. But once he does get to a safe location, he pulls over to the side of the road and he talks to the guy that he saved. And the guy tells him, I was the person that was tasked to steal the car before you were by Tony Blair. He wasn't honest with you, was he? Go open the front trunk, see what he actually wanted this car for. And when Eddie does it, it is large kilos of coke. Unfortunately, the guy that Eddie saved ends up dying when he backs up and gets hit by a truck, which Eddie relays to Susie once they get together. Right after Eddie is done relaying everything that just went down, he gets a phone call from Freddie's cell phone, and he thinks it's Freddie just telling him, I'm safe, but it's not. It's Mercy telling him, bring my weed back now. Eddie and Susie drive over to Mercy's chop shop, and there's Mercy with a machete, her two goons with guns, and Freddie, who is sitting chained up in a chair with a bag over his head. They try to explain to Mercy that they didn't know exactly what they were stealing, i.e. the coke. And now that they brought the coke back, they feel like it's only right that she let Freddie go. But Mercy doesn't feel like that is right. Mercy's pissed that someone tried to steal from her and she wants to make an example out of it. Eddie kind of figured this might be the case, so he decided to come with a backup plan. Tony Blair. He throws a tied up Tony Blair on the ground and says, that's the guy that hired us to steal this car. That's the guy that wanted to steal your coke. And now you've got him, you can let my brother go. She does make them sweat this out a little bit, but she accepts their offer, and then she proceeds to bludgeon Tony Blair to death. At that same time, the cosmic universe actually came together for Jimmy. Gabrielle does end up calling him back. She checks on him, and then she says, maybe we should meet up sometime. And Jimmy is all about that idea. When she hangs up the phone, though, the girl that actually stole the car looks at Gabrielle and says, you actually like him, don't you? And Gabrielle says no, but it's pretty clear that she does actually like Jimmy. She then tells this girl and a guy that Jimmy has agreed to meet her for dinner the next night. And then this mystery man lights Jimmy's van full of weed on fire. In episode 4, Jimmy and Gabrielle do end up meeting up a couple days later. She ends up convincing him to show her exactly where he works. Jimmy, just thinking that she's taking an interest in his life, is more than happy to show her the operation and all the strains of weed that he's created. But he also gets a little too chatty. He reveals to Gabrielle that this operation, the one at Eddie's estate, is actually one of the smaller operations. They have about 12 of them, and some of them are a lot bigger. And that's exactly the information that Gabrielle needed. Eddie's operation, though, might actually be expanding, despite his best efforts. Susie tells him that in order to make their money back from the weed that Jimmy lost, they need to expand the business and use the stables, which Eddie is not a fan of. He wants them off his property, not expanding on it. Susie, however, reminds him that he promised he would make them more money if they left the property, but yet they failed to get a detailed breakdown on exactly how he's going to do that. So until that happens, she's going to want to expand, at least for the time being, to make that money back. The two leave at an impasse. Eddie's actually got a funeral to attend. The 8th Lord of Bassington had a heart attack. The guy was batshit insane. I mean, absolutely nuts. But Eddie runs in the circles where lords end up attending other lords' funerals. So even though Eddie really didn't know this guy all that well, or really his family, he and his mother are going to attend. His mother, by the way, has taken a keen interest on Susie Glass's operation. She doesn't want Eddie wrapped up in it. She's a fan of Susie getting the hell out of there. When Eddie gives her the latest, he assures her, I'm not going to let them go into the stables and expand the business. And she offers her help. She wants to get them off the property. So she says, Eddie, I can see if maybe I can talk to somebody. But he says, no, Mom, that's not necessary. I will take care of it. The two then head off to this funeral, where Eddie's mom whispers in his ear that the new Lord Bassington is named Max. He's in his early 20s, and he actually knows Freddie from school. While Eddie is unfamiliar with Max, there is somebody in attendance that Eddie is familiar with, and that's Rosie. After the funeral, the two start chatting at the reception. Eddie's a little concerned about Rosie being friends with Stanley Johnston now that he knows how Stanley Johnston made his money, but Rosie doesn't seem all that concerned. And it's unclear to Eddie whether she knows how Stanley made his money or not. He then decides to change the subject, though, and asks Rosie, how well do you know Max? And she knows him a little bit. Max is a struggling artist. He wants to be an actor, and since his father died, he's been a little lost. This could be the perfect opportunity for Eddie to find a new location for Susie, so he asks Rosie to introduce him so that the two can have a conversation. When the two sit down and chat, Eddie is very covert about the nature of the business opportunity, but is pretty clear about what he's talking about, and Max is all for it. I mean, this is easy money for him. There's just one little issue that Max needs to take care of first. His father was being blackmailed. Some guy called up claiming that he has a dossier full of embarrassing information, and if he doesn't pay him $500,000, then he's going to leak it to the press. And Max can't let that happen. He's got a huge audition coming up, and even though his father is dead, that kind of negative publicity could lead him to losing the role. So he needs to take care of this covertly. And now that Eddie has come to him with this proposition, it's pretty clear that Eddie knows people who might be able to take care of a blackmailer. The other thing that Max asks is that when Eddie does end up getting the dossier, he doesn't open it. And Eddie is totally cool with that. So they have an agreement. If Eddie is able to take care of this blackmail situation, then Max will take on Susie's business. Eddie's pretty excited about this, and he heads to Susie's gym to give her the good news. But Susie says, we usually take a couple months to vet potential landlords. We don't just jump into bed with these people. She's also pretty hesitant because of this whole blackmail situation that's shady. But it is a really good offer, and she is willing to, at the very least, take a meeting to figure out whether or not she wants to get into bed with Max and his family. After getting the okay, Eddie is able to make contact with the blackmailer. He goes for the meeting site. And when he meets this guy, it's just some overweight dude in his 50s who's a wannabe journalist. Eddie brought the money, but this guy didn't bring the documents. He tells Eddie that he needs to go to a Chinese restaurant first. And when the two head to this Chinese restaurant, Eddie finds out that the documents are not there. The reason they had to head to this Chinese restaurant is because the journalist owed $500,000 to the guy who owned the restaurant, a big, giant guy. intimidating guy. The journalist figured, I'm just going to take this money, I'm going to hand it to this guy, I'll clear my debts, I'll eventually hand over the dossier, and we'll be good to go. But that's not the way Eddie sees it. He's not about to hand over $500,000 without getting the dossier first. And that's a problem for the restaurateur. This causes a fight between the restaurateur and Eddie. But it gets to a point where they're both way too tired to continue, so Eddie hops on the phone with Susie and explains the dilemma that he's in. And Susie tells him, put the guy on the phone. As soon as Susie Glass drops her name, and more importantly, her father's name, he changes his attitude quite a bit. During the fight, the journalist got scared off and ran. So the agreement that Susie has with the restaurateur is that if she pays the debt, he gives up the journalist's address, which he does. And Susie and Eddie head over there. To the surprise of the journalist, that's for sure. They see the guy's operation. He really just rummages through rich people's trash and finds dirt on them. Nothing more than that. And he's more than happy to hand over the dossier, but they want him to come with them. They need to confirm that whatever blackmail he had on Max's father is legit. And even though the blackmailer doesn't want to, he's kind of forced to. That night, all three of them head to Max's house. They deliver the dossier. And to his word, Eddie never opened it, even though Susie really wanted to. Max ends up opening it. He confirms that the embarrassing information is in fact in there, and then he throws it in the fire. But that's when the blackmailer ends up spouting off a little bit. He reveals to everybody that he was never blackmailing Max's father. He was blackmailing Max. Because Max has an interest in a very macabre collectible, if you will. Eddie, he's pissed off. He feels lied to, he feels betrayed, and he wants more information regarding the situation. So Max decides to show him what he collects. They go into a secret room, and Max collects Hitler paraphernalia. Hitler art, Hitler guns, Hitler flags. Oh, and then the coup de grace is Hitler's right nut that's just saved in a jar in formaldehyde. Yeah, the guy is like a Hitler nut. And he couldn't let word get out that he collects this kind of stuff, even though he has massive respect for Addie. Eddie feels like this is a non-starter, that they're going to have to find a new location because there's no way that Susie can get in a bed with this dude. But Susie is still entertaining the idea. She doesn't care what this guy collects. She cares about the business opportunity, and this appears to be a good one. But that's when all hell breaks loose. Because the journalist was standing there the entire time, and he was filming this interaction. But he was caught by Eddie's housekeeper, if you will. Guns were grabbed by everybody. They all had kind of a standoff, and then shots were fired. Eddie once again shines in these moments. He seems to be unflappable. And in the end, Eddie, Susie, and the journalist walk out unfazed. Well, the journalist is very much fazed. He was terrified. The housekeeper, she was killed, and Max was knocked out with the formaldehyde bright nut bottle, and he's laying in the building unconscious. When Felix arrives, Susie gives him the rundown on what to clean up and what to do, and then they all head home. Eddie's still trying to figure out at this point how he's going to deliver on his promise to make them more money. But as he's trying to relax in the wee hours of the morning, his mom walks in and gives him great news. She's found a location for Susie's operation. It's literally the neighbor. She was talking to Jeff about this, and he suggested the neighbor because he's in a little bit of a financial struggle. So she went over and talked to him, and he appears to be on board. Eddie is not only relieved, he's actually very impressed by his mother. And when he gives Susie the information, she says, okay, I'll take the meeting with the neighbor. In episode 5, Susie meets with her father, and business is going great. Business is booming. And because of that, they can't let Eddie go. But as Susie's dad says, Eddie's not going to want to go. He's now got a taste for this business. So while he says he wants an exit strategy, he doesn't actually want one. But if he were to actually want an exit strategy, he can't have one. Because no one just gets up and gets out. And if he plans on screwing the family over, Bobby says he'll chop his head off by the end of the year. Susie doesn't want that to happen, so she takes Eddie golfing, and she proposes that he expand his role in the business, not leave. Eddie, however, is pretty adamant he's going to want out by the end of the year. After they're done golfing, they head back to Eddie's place, and she picks his brain on a certain situation that they've found themselves in. They don't just grow weed and sell weed, they export weed through the harbors. Lately, however, those shipments have been getting seized by customs. And they're not supposed to, because they pay a guy named Florian DeGros who works at the docks to make sure that they don't get seized. DeGros is the definition of a blowhard. He likes the fancy lifestyle and he likes to hear himself talk. Susie's having her two bodyguards, Keith and Blanket, go and meet Florian and bring him to England. The issue that she really has, though, is that she can't stand this guy. And she can't figure out what is actually him just being him and what part of what he says is him trying to pull a fast one. So she wants Eddie to be in the room to discern whether or not this guy is screwing them over. When they bring Florian to the weed farm, Eddie is there along with Susie, Jimmy, Kenny, Blanket, and Florian says that the current situation is unfortunate, but there's not a lot he can do without more money. He's going to need $1.5 million to grease the palms of those that are in power so that their shipments are no longer getting seized. And after looking at the body language, Eddie is pretty convinced that this guy is just being greedy and is making all of it up. He pulls Susie aside and he tells her as much, but when Susie returns to the table, she offers Florian $1.2 million. And Florian doesn't take it. He's adamant that he's going to need 1.5. As the two are negotiating, the lights in the weed farm go out. Florian thinks that it's Susie trying to scare him. Susie thinks that it's Florian trying to pull a fast one, when in reality, it's neither. It's gypsies. Eddie and Blanket head up to the top to see what's going on when they notice that they're getting robbed. Gypsies have taken their two generators. But Eddie's not about to just let that happen. He gets in a cart and he starts chasing them down. And luckily, Jeff was already on hot pursuit as well. So they're able to trap one of the cars in. And that's when they see that they were being robbed by a girl who's probably mid-20s and two boys who look like they're about 11 years old. Eddie's not about to kill these people, even though the girl is dripping with attitude. She finds no remorse whatsoever in the fact that she just robbed them. And when Eddie asks why she robbed him, she says, well, it's, for the babies. I mean, look at you. You don't need these generators, but we do. They're freezing. So Eddie decides to show some compassion. He lets them take one generator, but he's not going to let them take two. This way, they can actually power up the weed farm and get the lights back running. This is concerning for Eddie, though. The fact that the gypsies are aware of his property, they're coming onto it, they're stealing from it. Jeff warns him that gypsies are not to be trifled with. They're going to have to tread carefully with this situation. Eddie returns back to the farm and he pulls Susie aside and they discuss what exactly they're going to do. Susie's going to send Florian back to Belgium and tell him that she'll think about it. And as for the gypsies, Eddie knows that if they have actually seen the farm, it could be an issue. Susie suggests that they pay the gypsies a visit, so the next day, Susie and Eddie head into this traveling circus. They meet with the leader of the gypsies, a guy named JP. The conversation starts out with Eddie looking for assurances that the gypsies will stay away from his property. And JP says, why? Is that because you're growing weed up there? That's pretty obvious. We found some of it. Susie feels like this is an attempt for JP to blackmail them. And JP tells her that he's not looking to blackmail her necessarily. He's looking to get in on the business. The gypsies have a bunch of set of skills that could be useful for their operation. At first, Susie's ready to walk out, but Eddie stops her because he realizes that the gypsies could be their solution for the docks. Gypsies are notorious for being able to get contraband across a border. JP's very interested, but he wants a drink. So that night, he heads to Eddie's house and they have a drink and discuss the plan further. JP tells them that if they want to do business with him, they have to party with him first. Him and his extended family. And that night, they tear it up. Susie, Eddie, even Freddie, they're all dealing with hangovers. But for JP and the gypsies, it's as if it never happened. They just stroll into Eddie's property and set up shop. It's definitely something that Eddie's mom was not expecting. And he embarrassingly says that he drunkenly agreed for them to stay a couple days. The gypsies quickly made themselves at home. One of the girls, the one that was actually caught by Jeff and Eddie trying to get away from the generator, she made her way into the stables and was checking out the horses. Jeff, trying to be hospitable, told her, why don't you take it out? And as the girl is riding around with the horse, Jeff and Sabrina, Eddie's mom, start chatting about the fact that this girl, this gypsy, seems awfully familiar. She has a striking resemblance to Jeff's daughter, Charlie. It doesn't really seem like Jeff and Charlie currently have a relationship because Sabrina gives Jeff an update on how Charlie is doing at school, but it might be a situation where Jeff had to distance himself because of the line of work he's in. While this gypsy girl rides around, JP was already hard at work figuring out a way to transport the weed across the borders. And the way he's going to do it is Mother Mary statues. These giant statues of Jesus' mom, but stuffed with weed. This works wonderfully. Their safe is filled with new money. Susie jokingly says, "Yeah, Eddie, you've definitely got a taste for this." And Susie and her dad aren't the only ones to notice this. That night, as Freddie is enjoying a cigar with his brother, he also mentions, "Eddie, you're good at this. I think they're actually grooming you." Eddie does reveal that they want to extend the work, but he can't quite figure out a reason on why he should do that. It appears, though, Eddie's intuition is correct in one aspect: Florian. With the weed now successfully getting over the border thanks to the gypsies, Florian has to answer to the guy who was paying him to make sure the weed didn't get over the border. This mystery man shows up in a car and Florian tells him, "I was certain that she stopped the shipments." To which the man replies, "My guy on the inside is over his skis, he's lost control, but I just need some time and I'll fix this." Whoever this guy is does not want that weed getting over the border. And the way that he decides to quote-unquote fix this is to steal Susie and Eddie's money. He has this guy on the inside set it up so that the prime suspect is the gypsies, specifically JP. After all, stealing is in their nature. And Keith even mentions how he saw JP looking shady near the entrance of the weed. So things aren't looking good for JP, and Eddie has to confront him. And JP doesn't deny it, but he does take it as an insult that Eddie is even coming to him with this. And Eddie says, "Dude, look at it from my perspective. The first time we met was you stealing from me." Once again, though, JP doesn't admit to anything. He just tells all the gypsies to pack up their stuff, and the next morning, when Eddie goes outside, the gypsies are gone. At this point, Eddie is starting to believe that JP really didn't have anything to do with stealing the money. So he heads to meet with Susie and he says, "Who benefits from us thinking that the gypsies stole this money?" And Susie says, "Florian, of course." They know that Florian couldn't have orchestrated this, especially because of the fact that he lives in Belgium. He's got to have somebody on the inside. So they meet with Florian and they poison him. They slap down the antidote and say, "If you don't give us the name of the guy on the inside, then you're going to die in roughly 3 minutes." And Florian starts to feel the effects of it. As he's gasping for air, he gives up the name, and the name is Keith. There's only one thing you can do with a situation like this. Keith has to go. And by go, I mean like dead. Eddie even has a good idea on how to do this. He wants to get JP and the rest of the gypsies. In order to get them back, though, he's going to have to apologize and also take a few punches. But at the end of it, JP decides to show up and extract his revenge on the guy who tried to set him up. They drive Keith out to the woods, they're all standing around, and Keith starts yapping. He starts telling them that they're no different from him. If they think that they're immune to the wrath of Bobby Glass, then they're kidding themselves. They're all going to end up dead. He even looks right at Eddie and says, "There's no getting out of this. You work for Bobby Glass right now. I hope you know that. He's going to get to you eventually, just like me and just like Jethro." And up until this point, Eddie wasn't really listening to Keith, but that perked his ears up. And he says, "What do you mean?" And Keith chuckles and says, "Oh, she didn't tell you?" "Yes, Susie had us kill Jethro. He's at the bottom of the Thames." You can't trust her. You can't trust any of them. And those are the last words that Keith says before he's shot. But the revelation that Jethro was killed when Susie gave Eddie her word that he would be in Australia, that's a lot for Eddie to think about as he makes his way out of those woods. In episode 6, once Edward gets back on property, he heads to Jeff to get some advice on what to do about the Susie Glass situation. He fills him in on the fact that it looks like if Eddie were to go through with pulling them out of this arrangement, that the Glass family is willing to kill him. And Jeff's suggestion is, just stay the course. See how this thing plays out. So Eddie does that. He meets with Susie the next day, and she tells him that business is going so well, and he cuts her off and says, "So I've reached the threshold where I can pull out of our arrangement?" And she reluctantly says yes. She does offer him another opportunity to extend their arrangement, but he's pretty adamant. "I'm out." To which Susie says, Okay, but in order for you to fully be out and the agreed upon threshold to be hit, we need to wash that money. It's 15 million and it's going to take about 3 months. And this pisses Eddie off because all he wants is to be out. And now she's finding a new way to extend. Susie can tell that Eddie's pissed off, so she says, let me set up a meeting between the guy that washes our money and you. And they're going to do that at Jack's next boxing match, which he wins easily. Once he hops out of the ring, he meets with a boxing promoter named Henry Collins, who assures him that his next fight needs to be a title fight and it needs to be with his promotion, which Jack is all in favor of. Henry Collins isn't a stranger in these parts. He knows who Susie is, he knows who Jack is, and he actually invites Susie out to a drink with him and Jack to discuss this matter further. But she says, no, thanks anyway. Me and the Duke actually need to meet with somebody. And that's the first time that Eddie meets with Henry Collins. The next meeting that Eddie has is with the money guy, Chucky, and he's a bit eccentric. The way he cleans money is odd, to say the least. His latest venture is going to be Korean corn dogs. And Chucky's business acumen doesn't leave a lot of faith with Eddie. But with Chucky assuring Eddie that he's the best money guy in the area and Susie saying the same thing, it's not like Eddie has a choice but to just go with the flow. The one issue is Chucky tells everybody that it's going to take about 4 or 5 months to clean the 15 million. Once again, Eddie gets more upset, and when Chucky notices this, he tells him, you need a good woman in your life, like the one that I have. And he shows Eddie a picture of her. He then wonders aloud, I wonder where she is, because she came to the fight with Chucky. And when Susie looks out of her office, she sees Jack going into the bathroom with Chucky's wife. She knows this has the opportunity to be an absolute shit show, so she tells Chucky, I'm going to go find her. Susie gets to the bathroom. She starts scolding her brother for sleeping with another guy's wife, but as she's doing it, Chucky walks in. He sees what's going on, and he gets right into Jack's face. And Jack, being a professional boxer, he knocks him out. But this kind of ruins the relationship between Jack, Susie, and Chucky. With the Glass family seemingly losing their money guy, it gives Eddie even more anxiety, but Susie assures him, I'll get it sorted. In order to blow off some steam, they decide to head to Henry Collins' post-fight party. It's at this party where Henry and Eddie are able to have their first real conversation. They first start talking about how Eddie got involved with the Glass family, and he's cagey about it, but he says enough. That, however, segues into business, and when Henry brings up Chucky, he mentions how Chucky wouldn't be his first choice to wash money. In fact, he probably wouldn't be his second or third choice. Intrigued, Eddie asks, well, do you know anybody more appropriate? And Henry tells him, yeah, I know a lot of people. This conversation, though, gets put on pause because Eddie had texted Rosie that he really wanted to meet with her. And when she shows up, he makes a beeline to the bar to have the conversation. He called Rosie there because he needs a meeting with Stanley Johnston. He's lost contact with him, and since Rosie knows him, he wants to go through Rosie to get that meeting. And she says, yeah, I can do that, but warning you, he's not a good person. And that's something that Eddie's not really concerned with at the moment. The next morning during breakfast, Eddie gets a phone call from Susie, and it's not good news. The Chucky situation has escalated. He's gone on social media blasting Jack and the entire family, so that still needs to be ironed out. And in the meantime, Jack has to train for his next fight, that title fight that Henry Collins had talked about, and he needs a place to do it. So she asks Eddie if Jack can stay there and train, and Eddie reluctantly says fine. Once Jack arrives, he gets him all set up with Jeff in the barn, and he allows Jack to do his thing. There's another matter, though, on the property that he needs to address. It's his brother, Freddie. The family's concerned because ever since Freddie found out about the marijuana farm, he's been very involved with Jimmy. Because of his past doings, the family's concerned, so Eddie goes and has a conversation with him about this. And yeah, it's something Freddie's really passionate about because he feels like he found a new strain of weed that is going to blow the roof off the industry. He's mixed it with coke, and he feels like this is the next big thing. He tried to talk to Susie about it, but she blew him off. And when he brings it up to Eddie, he also kind of blows him off because he thinks it's an impossibility. Mixing weed and coke, how does that happen? And when Freddie begs for a sit-down with Susie to discuss the matter further, Eddie cuts him off and says the Glass family cannot be trusted right now. They're very dangerous. They had Jethro killed and they lied to us, and they have no intention of leaving our property. And Freddie's completely fine with that. He doesn't want them to leave their land. He wants this industry to stay on property. Eddie, though, is adamant that he needs to get them off the property or else it's probably going to end with everybody dying. He knows he needs to do something about the money laundering situation. He's got to wash this $15 million and he can't be waiting 5 months. So later on that day, he goes and meets with Henry Collins. He gets right to the point. I need to wash $15 million. How long is it going to take? It's certainly not going to take 5 months. Henry introduces Eddie to his money guy, his Chucky, if you will. It's a guy named Thick Rick. And the way that Thick Rick washes money is he uses the boxing promotion. The fights are rigged. And when the fight finishes, you find out that there's a bunch of bets that were placed on the losing fighter, and that's how they wash the money. And Rick is meticulous. I mean, his books are immaculate, so if he ever gets questioned, he's got everything covered, or he's just going to bore you to death with accountant jargon. Eddie then heads back to his home, where Susie is actually waiting for him. I mean, Susie came there to just watch Jack and his training, but she brought good news. She's patched things up with Chucky. And she has even more good news. Chucky said he would do it really quick, which is 4 months. In reality, though, Chucky told her that it would only take 2 months to clean $15 million. Susie lied to Eddie and said 4 months. Eddie keeps his mouth shut. He never brings up the deal with Henry Collins. He then needs to step aside because he gets a phone call, and it's from Stanley Johnston's right-hand man. He tells the guy he wants to set up a meeting with Stanley Johnston, and it's set. But before he can do that, he needs to hand over the $15 million to Chucky when he arrives. Even though he would much rather go through Henry Collins, he's decided to not make waves and go through Susie's guy, Chucky. While he's loading in the money, though, Chucky keeps yapping. He won't shut up about good vibes, and that's when he drops a bombshell. He asks Eddie, why are you rushing so much? I mean, Susie said, take your time. And that's it. That's the final straw for Eddie. He's not going to hand over the $15 million to Chucky. He takes it right to Henry Collins and Thick Rick. After dropping off the money, he goes and meets with Susie, and he's diplomatic about it, but he tells her, I made an executive decision. Henry Collins is going to be washing the money. He said he could do it quicker. Susie keeps her cool, but she's pissed off. And she tells Eddie, I don't want that because I want Henry Collins focusing on Jack's boxing career, not money laundering. They go back and forth on the matter until finally Eddie says, you told Chucky to slow things down, not speed them up. And you did so because you and your father have no intention of letting me out of this deal and getting off our property. She shoots back that that's a wild accusation, and Eddie points out that's not a denial. Eddie then asks her, where's Jethro? And this time Susie's honest. She tells him that the reason that Jethro is dead is to protect him and his brother. Because eventually Jethro would pop up at an inopportune time. There's never a good time for a guy like that to pop up. And when he did, he would become a problem. And it might be tomorrow, it might be a week, it might be a month, it might be a couple of years down the line. But he would eventually become that problem. And Susie couldn't let that happen. So she took care of it. Upon hearing this, Eddie says, I'm going to ask you one more time. When are you going to let me and my family go? And once again, Susie's honest with him and says, never. Both of them kind of go through empty threats on why this would be a mistake for each side, and then they part ways. Susie's got to get to the fight, and Eddie has to get to his meeting with Stanley Johnston. He set this meeting up because he needed help getting out of the deal with the Glass family. He needed to bring somebody else in to protect him on the matter, and he felt like Stanley Johnston would be a good partner. Stanley's going to agree to help him, but it's going to come at a price. That price will come later. And Eddie's fine with that. The only requirement he has is that Stanley Johnston help him out of this deal and also leave the Glass family unscathed. As for Susie, she goes to Jack's fight where she runs into Freddie. Freddie finally gets an opportunity to sit down with her and discuss the new strain of weed that he's developed. He's really excited about it. But Susie doesn't really want to talk to him. That's when Freddie abandons the weed talk and gets serious about business with Susie. In a nutshell, he basically tells Susie that he doesn't want them leaving the property. He's all for them staying. And if something were to happen to Eddie, well, he would inherit everything. It's not hard to read between the lines of what Freddie is saying, but that doesn't sit well with Susie because she is so in touch with her family. So the fact that you've got Freddie sitting here ready to throw Eddie under the bus, quite literally, doesn't sit well with her. It puts a bad taste in her mouth. After she dismisses Freddie from the conversation, Jack's fight is about to start, but she gets called up to Henry Collins' office, which couldn't come at a worse time because of the fact that Jack's fight is about to start. But Henry doesn't feel like she needs to watch it because the fight is fixed. And unfortunately for Jack, he's the nail, he's not the hammer. The reason why Henry wanted this meeting is because he's done some recent calculations. 15 million, 14 properties, that's a lot of money. He's not looking to invest though. He wants to take over. He basically gives her two options. Hand over the business with Grace because he feels like she's unqualified to do it with her dad in jail. Or you don't hand over the business and they're going to go to war. Susie tells him that she's willing to take her chances. She's not the least bit concerned about what Henry Collins can do to her. But then she sees what Henry Collins can do to the family, as Jack gets absolutely pummeled and literally put in the hospital from his fight. In episode 7, Jimmy arrives back at the house after the fight, and he fills Eddie in on everything that happened. Jack is not doing well. He's in a coma. As soon as Eddie hears about this, he wants to go to Susie's house and make sure that she's okay. But Jimmy explains, Susie's house is a secret. I'm not really supposed to tell you. Although, since it's Jimmy, he does end up giving the address up. And when Eddie heads over there, he is greeted by a different Susie Glass. One that is not messing around, that is all business, and that is pissed off and not interested in getting any help from Eddie. After all, she says, you wanted out, remember? And the truth is, she doesn't need Eddie's help. She goes on the warpath, making those that were responsible for this pay. She ends up killing the fighter. She gets the referee. The only person she doesn't get is Collins. She's waiting to extract revenge on him. But before she can do that, she gets called to a meeting with her father because her father is also aware of what she's doing, and he does not approve. She's killing people in broad daylight. It's not a good look. Bobby's worried that now Collins knows that she's coming. The element of surprise is out the window. So he tells her, you need to stand down. I've got people that can take care of this, and you're not it. He basically orders her to go home and lay low. While Susie was meeting with her father, Eddie was meeting with Stanley Johnston's right-hand man to let him know that because of what happened with Jack, circumstances have changed and now he's reluctant to negotiate without the Glass family knowing about it. And the second in command tells Eddie that he also heard about what happened with Jack and he feels horrible about it. He tells him that he doesn't condone anything that Collins did. Violence and trickery, they don't have a place in the game. He does, though, have an offer that's mutually beneficial and ends peacefully. He tells Eddie that he knows that Eddie's house is one of a few houses. What he needs is for Eddie to get the names of those 13 locations because that will give Stanley Johnston leverage to negotiate with Bobby Glass in order to take over the business. Eddie tells him that he'll get to work on it, and when he arrives back home, he's got a big surprise. Charlie has returned home and she is pregnant. She didn't tell anybody. Everybody's thrilled for her, especially Jeff. And that's because, yes, Jeff is, in fact, her father. Although, Charlie doesn't know that. Once the congratulations are over and Charlie leaves the room, Eddie asks his mother for help with the matter of getting the list of names. While she doesn't have the names, she gives Eddie a person who probably would have the names. The guy's name's Tibbsy. Both Eddie and Freddie head over there because Freddie actually knows the guy a little bit. But once they get into the mansion, it's not what it seemed like. It's been overtaken by thugs and criminals. Tibbsy is basically relegated to one room in the house. Once Freddie, Eddie, and Tibbsy get alone, Tibbsy explains that he had a run-in with the Glass family that didn't end well. They didn't renew the contract, and because he needed the income, he went to somebody else, which, well, those other people have taken over the location, and they're not as nice as the Glass family. The good news is when Eddie explains the reason for them dropping in, Tibbsy has kept meticulous notes. He keeps a diary. He hands it over to Eddie, but when they go to leave, the thugs enter the room and they want the diary. They want everything. They tell Eddie that because it's in the house, they now own it. Eddie could probably take most of these guys, but he doesn't feel like getting into a violent scrum at the moment. So, in a way, he sort of allows them to shake him down for a watch and Freddie's pants, which is an embarrassing look as the two head out. As the two are leaving, they get into an argument. And it's during this argument that Freddie admits to Eddie he sort of implied to Susie Glass that if she were to get rid of Eddie, he would take over and allow the Glass family to stay on the property. He tells him this because he genuinely feels bad about it. But this admission by Freddie doesn't come with immediate forgiveness from Eddie. He's very angry. He tells his older brother that he's been a disappointment his entire life, and his entire life he's had to clean up his mess. And if they don't get out from under the Glass family, then what happened to Tipsy will likely happen to them. Eddie and Freddie then get in the car. They drive back to the house where Susie Glass is waiting for Eddie. She was in her apartment just as her dad told her to when she got an interesting phone call from Collins. Collins all but admits that he's working for somebody else. He's waiting for the okay to go after her. Now, Collins sent her a message through her delivery service for food, which means that he knows where she lives. This is now the second person in as many days to pay her a visit when her location is supposed to be a secret. So she's come to the house looking for answers from Eddie as to how he got her address. Eddie has to give up Jimmy's name, and when they confront Jimmy about it, he explains that he didn't give her address to Collins, but the way he got her address was through her Amazon account. Susie then asks Jimmy if anybody's been asking about her, and he says, yeah, actually, that girl that you thought stole our van, Gabrielle. It takes a bit of prodding, but eventually Jimmy admits that he gave Gabrielle her home address because Gabrielle apparently wanted to send Susie flowers after what happened to Jack. When both Eddie and Susie hear about this, they demand that Jimmy set up a meeting with Gabrielle at their usual spot so that they can get answers from her directly. He does it, and when Gabrielle shows up, she's pretty taken aback. She wasn't expecting this. She definitely doesn't want to talk at all. And it takes threatening Jimmy's life to get her to admit that the person who hired her wasn't Collins. It was Stanley Johnston. She spills the beans on everything. She was hired $20,000 to steal a van for a guy that she had never met who ends up being Stanley Johnston's right-hand man. They then threatened to kill her if she didn't cozy up to Jimmy, and once they found out that she had an in, they made her get as much information as possible from him. She goes on to tell him that it was Stanley Johnston who slowed down the exporting of the weed. After his inside man, Keith, was killed, Stanley had to turn somewhere else, and that's when he turned to Collins. That, however, ended up being a bad move because the plan was never to put Jack in a coma. Collins just went too far. Susie believes this entire story because it checks out. And if Stanley Johnston were to get all the estates, he'd be the biggest supplier in the world. Before they can deal with Stanley Johnston, though, they have to deal with Collins first. And in order to get to Collins, they're going to use Gabrielle. Right before she breaks off the conversation, she makes Eddie assure her that he's with her. And he says he is, but it's not overly convincing. At least not with what we know. With Eddie assuring her, though, she goes into plan 2, which is making Gabrielle work for her. She tells Gabrielle to text Stanley Johnston the location of where Jack is being treated, although it's a fake location. It's not the right floor. They're setting Collins up. And that's exactly what happens. They completely set him up. They catch him off guard. But with Collins staring down the barrel of Susie Glass's gun, he drops a bombshell on her. He tells her that Stanley Johnston can corrupt anybody. He's even got Eddie under his thumb. And yeah, that's what it looks like, but it's not. Eddie did hand over a list of names to Stanley Johnston's right-hand man, but after doing so, he headed to meet with Bobby Glass, and he told him everything. How he was actively helping Stanley Johnston acquire his business, which was really peculiar to Bobby Glass. I mean, why would Eddie show up and tell him this? And he says, so you're screwing me over twice? But Eddie says, no, not quite. The thing is, Eddie didn't get a chance to explain his grand plan to Susie. And once Susie hears that Eddie is reportedly working for Stanley Johnston, she wants that taste of revenge again. So when she gets home, she calls up the gospel, and she tells him, I know what actually happened to your brother. And in the season finale, the gospel comes over to the hotel room where Jack is being treated, and Susie tells him that it was all Freddie. So naturally, after leaving the hospital, the gospel and all of his men head over to Eddie's place. Before they can even do anything, though, they're seen by Jeff, who calls up Eddie. And when Eddie gets down there, he sees exactly what Jeff sees, which is the gospel praying with probably 10 guys. And he has no idea what the gospel is doing there. So he calls up Freddie, and Freddie also has no idea what the gospel is doing there. But it's pretty clear that the gospel didn't come to do a sermon. The gospel came for one reason and one reason only, and that's to extract revenge. Initially, because he's a man of principle, the gospel doesn't bum rush the house. He actually calls up Freddie. And he tells him, we can do this one of two ways. You come out or I'm coming in. While the gospel talks to Freddie, Susie is on the phone with her dad. When Bobby mentions Eddie, Susie says, don't worry about him. He sold us out, so I sold him out. And Bobby tells his daughter, you're about 24 hours late, so whatever you did, you better undo because I need his grace happy. And when Susie says, well, what I did was sell him out to the gospel, Bobby orders her to undo it immediately. It was a mistake. Susie realizes that she really messed this one up. So she calls up Eddie, who is walking back into the house, and she apologizes and says that the cavalry is on his way, which the cavalry is going to be Jimmy delivering a bunch of ammunition and guns so that they can defend themselves. This is a really, really tense situation. Eddie and his entire family gear up for what they feel like is going to be a war. But in the end, it was all for nothing because Bobby Glass took care of it. He calls up the gospel and tells him that if he just goes home, he'll make it up to him. And the gospel takes his offer. With the dust settled, Eddie and Susie end up going to meet with Bobby. Bobby tells both of them that after he cleaned up their mess, they owe him one. So what they're going to do is take bids on his business because he's done. He's out of the game. And he's going to sell it to the highest bidder. It's up to Susie and Eddie to go around and solicit those bids. As Susie and Eddie leave, Eddie confronts Susie on the fact that she just accepted what her dad said. It's pretty obvious that Susie wants his business, but she's willing to just not only not take it over, but go out and solicit bids. It makes no sense to him. And she tells him there's no point because when the old man makes up his mind, it's done. And if he wants to sell, he's selling. There's no convincing him out of it. So there's no point of arguing. The only thing to do is just get these bids. What Eddie's concerned with is that if they sell off Bobby's business, whoever ends up buying it won't let Eddie out of the deal. So he really wants Susie to take this over because he feels like she will actually honor it. Susie, though, is steadfast. They just should do her dad's bidding and get it done with. And the first person they approach is Stanley Johnston. It's pretty clear that he wants the business. Stanley tells him that, yeah, he's really interested in the business, and he feels like he has a trump card because, quote, one of Susie's disgruntled staff leaked the other members of the consortium, and with that information, he now has the upper hand. But Eddie says, no, not quite. The list I gave your man was fake. All those numbers, they were cell phones that went to my family members. We played you. Stanley's not even that mad. He's just more impressed, and it means that he's going to have to really, really bid up if he wants the business. Now, the next person they go to is Mercy. They know that Mercy's customers, aka the cartel, would be very interested in the business. So she's definitely going to put in a bid. And then the final person they approach is Sticky Pete. He doesn't have any money, but he also has connections. So there's the three options. But Eddie, he's going to be the fourth option. After all, he's been getting told that he's born for this business, so might as well make a play for it. He alone, along with Susie, they don't have the money. They're going to have to get other parties interested. So what he wants to do is get those other 12 families together and go in on the deal. He's also going to get the travelers involved in this business. And even then, there's two problems. One, they're not going to be able to outbid Stanley Johnston. And two, they're going to need Susie Glass to run this business, and right now she's not interested in it. Susie and Eddie have done a complete 180 on the whole deal. For the longest time, it was Eddie who didn't want to be interested, and Susie wanted to be, and now it's the opposite. He approaches his mother to go have a conversation with Susie and maybe convince her to come back in on the deal. And then he gets a brilliant idea on how to get more money, and that's going to involve Henry Collins. While Susie's getting convinced that maybe she should go back in on the family business, Eddie sits down with Collins and explains that he can get him in on this deal. It's going to cost $15 million, and because of his penance that he's going to have to pay, he's going to have to do a little bit of dirty work. That's because Eddie plans on getting the other three people out of this deal. That means Mercy, Stanley Johnston, and Sticky Pete are gone. That's only going to leave one option for Bobby Glass, and that is Eddie. Collins, with no other options, he's in. And after a talk with Sabrina, Susie's been convinced to come back in. Collins is really the linchpin of Eddie's grand plan. Because Eddie knows that the winning bid is going to be Stanley Johnston, so he needs to take him out. And the way to do that is through Thick Rick. Thick Rick is able to get Stanley Johnston's tax records and deliver them to the English equivalent of the IRS. So when Stanley Johnston wins that bid and he goes to pull the money out, he's arrested. The second winning bid was actually Mercy, but Eddie tells Mercy that it was Sticky Pete, knowing full well that Mercy, being a psychopath, would take Sticky Pete out, and that's exactly what she does. She butchers him to death in a parking lot. Then comes Henry Collins's penance. Once Mercy's done, Henry Collins pulls up and puts a bunch of shotgun shells in her. Now, all 3 options are done. And as for Collins, he delivers the $15 million as promised, but he's not in on the deal. No, Henry Collins went way too far. He was played. Jeff is waiting with a shotgun to his head, and they tie him up and wait to decide what they're going to do with him. And then, the only option, Susie and Eddie head to Bobby Glass and tell him that even though there are all those great bids, there's only one he can accept. But it turns out Collins wasn't the only one being played, so was Eddie and Susie. Because Bobby never had an interest in selling his business, he just wanted to wake his daughter up. Bobby has no plans on retiring. The bid that they're submitting is to invest in the business, not take it over. He did all of this because he wanted to know that they were actually committed to the mission. So the business will now be run by Bobby Glass, Eddie, and Susie. And now that they've patched things up, Eddie has a gift for Susie waiting for her in the woods. It's a tied-up Henry Collins. And once they leave Bobby's, that's exactly where they head. Susie, though, doesn't want to kill him. She actually offers it to Eddie. And Eddie decides to put him 6 feet in the dirt. But there's one wild card to all of this, and that is Stanley Johnston, because when he was arrested, he was sent away to the same prison as Bobby Glass. And now, the two are sitting there eating filet mignon, discussing business, because after all, they're roommates. And that is the end of The Gentleman Season 1. Thank you so much for getting this part of the recap. I really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing to the channel or becoming a member. That'd be cool. I have like hats and t-shirts. You can buy that, and keep me above the poverty line. That'd be cool because I got bills to pay. Be nice in the comments section. Nasty comments make me feel bad, like everybody else. So if you don't like the video, just like leave a thumbs down and just keep it moving. I'd appreciate that. And when Season 2 rolls around, I'll be here. Don't worry. But I sincerely thank you for getting this part of the recap and watching it and hopefully letting the ads run so I can stay above that poverty line that we discussed a little bit earlier.